Thank you very much, James. Lots of stuff to think about. But I think, I mean, especially this point of how do we get a rational, evidence-based, long-term approach to the new technologies, the opportunities, the power, the reach that they have, the limits that they have, which may be too much to ask since all of this is new and developing very fast, but at the same time very needed, which leads me nicely towards evidence-based and up-to-date information from Mark Harvey about social media and the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions.
Thank you, Bettina. Yes, I'm not going to quite sort of look at the oscillations in sort of the sentiments of the sort of the international development policy around communications, but share with you it was some internal research that we commissioned within 2 or 3 weeks of the changes in Tunisia and Egypt, and I think Bettina's done a great job in hyping that research. It's very much headline research that's been used to sort of help form our own thinking. But maybe towards the end of it, I'll share with you some of my own thoughts about the implications of that for us as a media assistance organisation such as the BBC World Service Trust. By the way, we've been working in the region for 4 or 5 years. We had been working in Tunisia and Egypt in the lead up to the huge changes that had occurred. In Egypt, for instance, we'd been working in 8 Egyptian universities, actually training students and civil society groups in how to use a range of media, radio, print, and new media. And in Tunisia, we'd been working with women's groups in training them as to how to actually project their voices and to get their opinions and perspectives into the media space, both the controlled media and through social media. And lastly, perhaps I should give you a slight health warning that I'm not a regional expert myself, nor am I a social media expert. This research actually kind of threw up a few kind of small surprises, but maybe confirmed a number of our instincts. Perhaps I should draw your attention to the box with the yellow script. We picked up on the fact that of the 52 million Twitter users who were actually tweeting or retweeting hashtags with Egypt, Tunisia, or a whole range of associations, actually far less than 1% identified themselves as being from Egypt, Yemen, and Tunisia. Now, even if you factor in the fact that a large number of users were hiding their location identities, I think it's fair to say that certainly in the case of Twitter, there are actually relatively few local users or producers, and that actually what was key was the way in which that information coming from them was powered by global networks. What were these global networks and how were they interacting? Perhaps I should go from left to right. On the left-hand side, that you can really see the sort of the citizen tools, landline, mobile phones, video cameras, which were in turn, the information from which was in turn distributed by some very familiar social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, plus actually some local and regional ones, and distributed but also used to actually synchronize information, perhaps also to check and to source, and were actually became in themselves this sort of central set of social media platforms a space for debate. And lastly, on the right-hand column, you had the established media. Actually, I don't think Flickr should be right at the bottom there. Arguably, it should be replaced perhaps by the Telegraph. You had the established media, many of it international media, who were actually globalizing and legitimizing this information, and actually perhaps becoming the final link in this kind of dynamic that really shaped the kind of the political developments themselves. I think the one thing that we instinctively understood that was kind of confirmed by this headline research was that actually social media do not themselves create social movements. I think the comment from Ben Wederman from CNN is quite telling in itself, that when he was on the ground, he said, no one I spoke to in Tunis was mentioning Twitter, Facebook or WikiLeaks. It's all about unemployment, corruption and oppression, and that actually the underlying driving factors of social movements have nothing actually to do with these platforms, and that it's actually somewhat perhaps demeaning and insulting to the people who are actually caught up in these movements to suggest that these things are propelling them. There are actually far deeper issues that are actually underlying social movements. Social movements are what social movements actually get from social media is an amplification, an echoing, and a powering. And I'd lastly say that they also get a huge sort of capacity to mobilize. And if we look at that quote on the bottom from the 21-year-old Egyptian student who first sent the first tweet using the January the 25th hashtag, he said that actually it was the hashtags Tunisia and Sidi Bouzid that allowed protesters to follow the events for the whole month beforehand, whilst they were actually barely being covered by the state-controlled media, and that in turn convinced us of the power that each of us had to affect change. So I think this kind of the mobilizing power of social media is clearly displayed in that. We looked a little bit harder at Egypt, and you have this kind of flow, arguably, that begins with mobilization, and the key role, for instance, in the case of Egypt, in the We Are All Khalid Said page, which really was the springboard, as it were, for the January the 25th protests. But actually, during the protests, examples of citizens helping to protect one another, for instance, from snipers and police and looters using social media. And then if you look at the last two categories, countering rumor or propaganda and helping government analyze government statements, it's clear that actually in Egypt people did use Facebook to actually collectively come to a view that the information coming from the government about water being poisoned was false, or that they collectively came to a view that what Mubarak was saying was unacceptable. Now, those last two functions arguably are the role of traditional media in established non-repressive media systems. In other words, the quashing of rumor and the consensus that emerges around information over time. And if you look at that last category, forming a consensus opinion. I mean, the role of media in actually forming political opinion. So it's interesting that social media had this in that very intense period this surrogate function, because the state-controlled media was clearly not actually being used in that way at all. What are the implications of this for an organization like Internews? And here I think I'd like to connect up with, I think, some of James's comments. I think that there is this kind of this euphoric kind of rush that is occurring at the policy level, and I think for us there's a kind of a short-term opportunity, but it could be a distorting one, around linking it with the kind of the accountability and the participation agenda. And you can see evidence of it from policymakers everywhere. Robert Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, gave a speech in which he said, actually voice participation. Look at what's happened in Tunisia and Egypt. Look at the role of social media. Actually supporting these processes is not just good politics, it's good economics. Well, yes, that's great to hear that, and that's a breakthrough in itself to hear from the World Bank. But I think one of the dangers is that actually we see this overinvestment in social media, this expectation that it will be transformational in the short term, and that actually a kind of a concentration on that as almost the public sphere is going to be hugely damaging in the long term, as we hope to see a transition occurring. So in our view, it's vitally important that the traditional media agenda, the kind of the strategies for supporting media law, for instance, in Tunisia, and the transition of the radio and television sector into something independent and commercially sustainable, that those strategies are looked at as carefully as the kind of the ability of civil society groups to use Twitter. And I think a sort of a second danger is that of the risk of us being instrumentalized, that actually people start coming to Internews and the BBC World Service Trust and say, hey, you guys, don't you do trainings on Facebook in some of these closed states? And these agendas may actually be linked to political change in the immediate. In other words, regime change. And I think we as organizations with missions around access to information, freedom of information, have to be extremely leery of that, because we are not in the business. We are completely neutral in our stances to regimes. We have to be, just as actually we have to be on an issue such as climate change and what the negotiated emissions agreement should have been in Copenhagen or should be in Durban at the end of this year. We are really in the business of trying to support local media systems and civil society in its communicative capacity, that as a kind of a public good in itself, independent of any short-term considerations. But I do think the kind of the hugely visible success of or certainly the role of social media in Tunisia and Egypt risks, I think, bringing kind of what's the right word? I think dangerous donors to our doors, and we really need to be sort of wary of how we deal with them.
Thank you very much. So we're moving from dangerous liaisons to dangerous donors. I will use that again. I think what you